Imagine standing in the ruins of Rome, surrounded by the echoes of emperors whose shadows still dominate the world. Augustus, Caligula, Nero, Commodus. Names drenched in glory, terror, madness. But what if the stories you know weren't born from truth, but from the pens of a few obscure writers, men with grudges, men with agendas, men who shaped the reputations of rulers long after they'd turned to dust? This is the story of how biographies became weapons, how intimate rumors became immortal fact, and how the most powerful men in history were defined not by their deeds, but by the storytellers who survived them. The emperors may have ruled Rome, but their biographers ruled time, and their words still whisper through history, shaping our understanding of power, humanity, and the fragile boundary between truth and myth. In the heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns stretched toward the heavens and the roar of the Colosseum echoed through stone streets, there existed a terror more potent than any gladiator's sword, more deadly than any military defeat. It was the terror of reputation, the fear of what people would say about you, not just in your lifetime, but for all the centuries that would follow. For a Roman emperor, power was absolute yet fragile. You could command legions, reshape the map of the known world, drain the treasury to build monuments that scraped the sky. But you could not control the one thing that mattered most after death: your story, the narrative that would define you when your bones had long since turned to dust. This obsession with reputation wasn't vanity, it was existential necessity. In Rome, your legacy was your immortality. The emperors understood this. They commissioned statues, inscribed their victories on triumphal arches, minted coins bearing their profiles. They wanted to control how history remembered them. But here is the cruel irony that haunted every ruler who sat on the throne of the Caesars. No matter how many monuments they built, no matter how many proclamations they issued, their final reputation would be decided by someone else, by men they never met, by writers who would outlive them. These writers worked in the shadows of empire, collecting rumors, documenting scandals, preserving the whispers that circulated through the palace halls. They wrote years, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries after the emperors they described had died. And in those pages, covered with ink and ambition, they created the versions of these rulers that we still know today. The pen wasn't just mightier than the sword, it was deadlier. Because while the sword could end a life, the pen could destroy a reputation for eternity. Let me introduce you to the men who held this terrible power. The obscure writers whose names you might not recognize, but whose work shaped everything you think you know about Rome's emperors. These were not objective historians in any modern sense. They were political actors, gossip collectors, moralists with agendas, and sometimes, quite possibly, forgers. First, there was Suetonius. Born Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus around the year 69 AD, he lived in an era when the memory of Nero's reign was still fresh, still raw. Suetonius worked as a secretary in the imperial court under the Emperor Hadrian, which gave him access to palace archives, private letters, official documents. He could read the correspondence of dead emperors, thumb through their personal accounts. This proximity to power shaped his masterwork, The 12 Caesars, a collection of imperial biographies that reads less like history and more like the most scandalous tabloid ever written. Suetonius had a particular fascination with the private lives of emperors, not their military campaigns or their legislative achievements, but their sexual habits, their superstitions, their peculiar dining customs. He collected rumors the way a curator collects artifacts, preserving every salacious detail about who slept with whom, who had unusual fetishes, who died in embarrassing ways. His work is entertaining, vivid, impossibly detailed. It is also deeply unreliable. Suetonius repeated gossip without verification. He included anecdotes that were probably invented. He shaped emperors into characters rather than documenting them as complex human beings. Then there was Tacitus. Born around 56 AD, Publius Cornelius Tacitus came from the senatorial class, and this shaped everything he wrote. Tacitus was a moralist, a man who believed deeply in the old Roman virtues of the Republic: honor, duty, restraint, senatorial dignity. He watched as emperors accumulated more and more power, reducing the Senate to a ceremonial body, and this filled him with bitter resentment. His histories, particularly the Annals and the Histories, are masterpieces of Latin prose. They are also dripping with bias. Tacitus had no love for the imperial system. He viewed the emperors as tyrants who had corrupted Rome's ancient freedoms. When he wrote about rulers like Tiberius or Nero, he did so with a prosecutor's zeal, highlighting every cruelty, every act of paranoia, every moral failing. His prose is dark, cynical, psychologically penetrating. He understood that history wasn't just about recording facts. It was about passing moral judgment on the powerful, and Tacitus judged harshly. The third figure is Cassius Dio, a Greek senator who wrote his Roman history in the early 3rd century AD, decades after the events he described. Dio had served in government, had witnessed imperial politics from the inside, and this gave his work a certain political sophistication. But Dio was also writing centuries after some of the emperors he covered, which meant he relied heavily on earlier sources, many of which no longer survive. He filtered older accounts through his own perspective, shaped by the political realities of his time. His biographies blend careful research with speculation, eyewitness accounts with second-hand gossip. And finally, there is the most mysterious source of all, the Historia Augusta. This is a collection of imperial biographies supposedly written by 6 different authors in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, but modern scholarship has revealed something astonishing. The Historia Augusta is probably a fraud. A single author, writing much later, created these biographies and attributed them to earlier writers to give them credibility. The work is filled with invented documents, fabricated letters, biographical details that appear nowhere else. Parts of it may be based on real sources. Other parts seem to be pure fiction. We still don't know which is which. These were the men who shaped the reputations of Rome's emperors: a court gossip collector, a senatorial moralist, a political insider writing centuries later, and possibly a forger. These strange men in the shadows held a power that transcended military might or political office. They held the power to decide how history would remember the most powerful individuals who ever lived. In Rome, biography was not a neutral act. It was a form of political warfare. When you wrote about an emperor, you were taking a side, advancing an agenda, settling scores. The emperors themselves understood this, which is why they tried so desperately to control their own narratives. But once they died, they lost that control, and their reputations became battlefields where different factions fought for dominance. Consider the case of Tiberius, Rome's second emperor. During his lifetime, he was respected as a capable military commander, a competent administrator who carefully managed the empire's finances. But after his death, his reputation was systematically destroyed. Why? Because Tiberius had alienated the senatorial class. He had been suspicious of aristocrats, paranoid about conspiracies, harsh in his treatment of perceived enemies. The senatorial writers who came after him, particularly Tacitus, portrayed him as a monster, a paranoid tyrant who spent his final years in depraved seclusion on the island of Capri, indulging in unspeakable vices. The stories about Tiberius became increasingly lurid with each retelling. Suetonius claimed that he trained young boys to swim between his legs while he bathed, calling them his little fishes. This image, so vivid and disturbing, has stuck to Tiberius for 2,000 years. But is it true? We don't know. It might be true. It might be senatorial propaganda designed to humiliate a dead emperor who had made powerful enemies. The point is that once such a story entered the biographical tradition, it became indelible. It shaped how every subsequent generation understood Tiberius. Or consider Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD. During his reign, he was an effective administrator who strengthened the empire's borders and maintained tight control over the bureaucracy. But he was also autocratic, demanding to be addressed as master and god, and he executed several prominent senators on charges of conspiracy. When he was assassinated, the Senate unleashed its fury. They passed a formal condemnation of his memory, ordering his name erased from monuments, his statues pulled down. This was called damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, the closest thing to historical annihilation that Rome could inflict. The writers who came after, particularly Tacitus and Suetonius, portrayed Domitian as a tyrant consumed by paranoia, a cruel persecutor of innocent men, a monster who deserved his violent end. But archaeological evidence and contemporary inscriptions suggest a more complicated picture. Provincial populations seem to appreciate his administrative competence. The military respected his military reforms. But these voices didn't write the histories. The senatorial class did. Biography was how political factions continued their battles after the emperors died. It was how the Senate took revenge on rulers who had diminished their power. It was how one dynasty delegitimized the dynasty that came before. The Flavian emperors, Vespasian and his sons, needed to justify their overthrow of the Julio-Claudian line. So the final Julio-Claudian emperor, Nero, was portrayed as an insane tyrant whose removal was necessary and virtuous. Later emperors used biography to attack their predecessors, to position themselves as saviors who rescued Rome from chaos. This meant that Roman imperial biography was never just about documenting what happened. It was about constructing narratives that served contemporary political needs. Every scandalous anecdote, every dramatic death scene, every tale of depravity had a purpose. These stories weren't preserved because they were true. They were preserved because they were useful. Here is what makes this so profoundly significant. The reputations created by these obscure writers didn't just shape how Romans understood their own history. They shaped how every subsequent civilization understood power, leadership, tyranny, and human nature. When we think of what makes a bad emperor, we are drawing on categories and examples established by Suetonius and Tacitus. When we imagine ancient Rome, we see it through their eyes. A single rumor, recorded by a biographer with an agenda, could define someone for 2,000 years. Caligula's reputation as a deranged madman comes almost entirely from Suetonius. Nero's image as a vain, cruel artist who fiddled while Rome burned derives from hostile senatorial sources. Commodus is remembered as a gladiator-obsessed fool because of Cassius Dio's contemptuous account. These images have been repeated in countless histories, novels, films, television shows. But what if they're wrong? What if the stories we've inherited are distortions, exaggerations, or outright fabrications? What if the emperors we think we know are really just characters created by biographers who lived generations later, who had their own political agendas, who were more interested in moral lessons than historical accuracy? The stakes could not be higher, because if our understanding of Rome's emperors is based on unreliable sources, then everything we think we know about power and its corruptions may need to be reconsidered. The cautionary tales we've drawn from Roman history, the warnings about absolute power and moral decay, the examples we cite in political debates today, all of it rests on a foundation that may be less solid than we imagine. But who were the emperors behind these stories? Were they the monsters we were taught to fear, or something entirely different? To answer that, we need to look past the biographies, past the gossip and the propaganda, and try to glimpse the human beings who lived under the crushing weight of absolute power. Imagine for a moment what it meant to be a Roman emperor, not the fantasy version, the one where you lounge on silk cushions being fed grapes by attendants, the real version, the one where you wake every morning knowing that your friends, your advisors, perhaps even your family members might be plotting to kill you, where every meal could be poisoned, where every guard could be a hired assassin, where trust is a luxury you cannot afford. This was the daily reality for Rome's emperors. The position came with godlike power and a paranoia that bordered on madness because the paranoia was rational. Emperors were murdered with shocking regularity. Caligula was stabbed to death by his own guards. Claudius was likely poisoned by his wife. Domitian was assassinated by members of his household. Commodus was strangled in his bath. The list goes on. The average reign of a Roman emperor in the first 3 centuries AD was less than 7 years. Beyond the constant threat of assassination, there was the sheer psychological burden of the role. An emperor was expected to be everything: military commander, religious leader, judge, administrator, public performer. He had to make decisions that affected millions of lives, often with incomplete information, always with factions pulling him in different directions. He could never show weakness, never admit doubt, never reveal the fear that surely gnawed at him in the dark hours of the night. Sleep must have been difficult. When you are responsible for an empire that stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia, when a rebellion in one province or a plague in another could topple your regime, when your enemies are watching for any sign of vulnerability, rest becomes impossible. The Roman sources occasionally preserve these moments of imperial insomnia, these glimpses of rulers lying awake, tormented by the weight of power. And then there was the profound isolation. An emperor lived in a world where genuine human connection was nearly impossible. Everyone wanted something from you, everyone had an agenda. Friendship was always transactional. Love was strategic. You could never know if people valued you as a person or simply as the vessel of imperial power. This isolation could drive even stable personalities toward paranoia, toward cruelty, toward the very behaviors that the biographers would later catalogue as evidence of tyranny. The biographers occasionally let us see this human vulnerability, though often inadvertently. They record moments of imperial weakness, of fear, of grief, usually as evidence of character flaws. But if we read these moments generously, if we allow these emperors to be fully human rather than caricatures of good or evil, a different picture emerges. Take Augustus, the first emperor, the one who supposedly brought peace and stability after decades of civil war. The official propaganda portrayed him as a near-divine figure, the father of his country, the restorer of Roman greatness. His reign was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Statues showed him as eternally youthful, serene, powerful, but Suetonius preserves a different Augustus in scattered anecdotes, a man haunted by the bloodshed that brought him to power. As a young man, Octavian, as he was then known, had been ruthless in his pursuit of power. During the civil wars, he participated in the proscriptions, the systematic murder of political enemies. Thousands of Roman citizens were killed, their property confiscated, their families destroyed. Octavian authorized these killings without hesitation. It was politically necessary, he believed, to eliminate rivals and secure his position. But the memory of this violence seems to have troubled him in his later years. Suetonius tells us that Augustus suffered from nightmares, that he was superstitious, constantly consulting omens and astrologers, terrified of thunder and lightning. He would hide in underground chambers during storms, trembling like a child. This is usually presented as evidence of Augustus's personal quirks, his human foibles, but perhaps it was something deeper, perhaps it was guilt. The psychological cost of having ordered so many deaths, of having waded through rivers of blood to reach the throne. The nightmares and superstitions might have been symptoms of what we would now recognize as trauma, the mind's attempt to process unprocessable horrors. Augustus also suffered profound personal losses that the official propaganda couldn't entirely erase. His beloved nephew and heir Marcellus died young, then his close friend and son-in-law Agrippa died. Then his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, the boys he had been grooming to succeed him, both died in their 20s. Each loss devastated him. By the end of his life, Augustus was left with Tiberius, his stepson, a man he had never particularly liked, but who was the only viable heir remaining. The great founder of the Roman Empire died, having buried most of the people he loved. Consider Caligula, whose very name has become synonymous with insanity and depravity. The stories about him are genuinely shocking. Suetonius claims he had incestuous relationships with his sisters, that he planned to make his horse a consul, that he declared himself a god and forced senators to worship him, that he committed random acts of cruelty for entertainment. These stories have defined Caligula for 2 millennia. He has become the archetypal mad emperor, the symbol of absolute power's ability to corrupt absolutely. But who was Caligula before he became a monster? His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. The nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, came from his childhood, when he was dressed in miniature military uniform and paraded before Roman legions by his father, the popular general Germanicus. Caligula's early years were marked by unimaginable trauma. When he was 7 years old, his father died under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned. The Emperor Tiberius, paranoid about potential rivals, targeted Caligula's family. His mother and 2 older brothers were arrested on fabricated charges. His mother was exiled and eventually starved to death. His brothers were imprisoned and killed. Caligula survived by being careful, by attracting as little attention as possible. As a teenager, he lived with Tiberius on the island of Capri, watching the aging emperor execute anyone he deemed a threat. Caligula learned to suppress his emotions, to wear whatever mask was necessary for survival. When Tiberius finally died and Caligula became emperor at age 24, he initially seemed promising. He released political prisoners, restored democratic processes, put on elaborate games for the people. Rome celebrated him as the dawn of a new era. Then 6 months into his reign, Caligula fell seriously ill. When he recovered, something had changed. The ancient sources suggest that the illness transformed him, that he emerged from it paranoid, unstable, cruel. But perhaps the illness was less important than what preceded it. Perhaps the years of watching his family destroyed, of living in constant fear, of suppressing his true self, had created psychological damage that could not be sustained. Perhaps what the biographers interpreted as madness was actually the collapse of a traumatized young man under pressures no human being should have to endure. This doesn't excuse the cruelties Caligula may have committed, but it complicates the simple narrative of the mad tyrant. It suggests that behind the monster was a person who had been profoundly damaged by circumstances beyond his control. And it raises the question of how much of his alleged madness was real and how much was exaggerated by writers who needed him to be a villain. Then there is Nero, another emperor whose reputation is irredeemably dark. He is remembered as the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, who executed his mother, who persecuted Christians, who was so vain and deluded that he believed himself a great artist despite having no talent. The ancient sources portray him as a narcissist, a dilettante who preferred singing and acting to governing, a man who murdered anyone who threatened his ego. But again, if we look past the propaganda, we find something more complicated. Nero became emperor at age 16, thrust onto the throne by his ambitious mother, Agrippina. For the first 5 years of his reign, he was essentially a puppet, with real power held by his advisors, particularly the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. These men presented Nero as the ideal young ruler, merciful and cultured, committed to justice and the welfare of the people. Nero's relationship with his mother, however, was toxic. Agrippina had maneuvered ruthlessly to place him on the throne, and she expected to control him. She inserted herself into government decisions, demanded honors usually reserved for emperors, made it clear that Nero owed everything to her. As Nero grew older and tried to assert his independence, Agrippina resisted. The sources claim that she threatened to support a rival claimant to the throne, Britannicus, Claudius's biological son. Whether this threat was real or imagined, Nero believed it. Britannicus died, almost certainly poisoned, during a banquet. Nero's relationship with his mother deteriorated into open hostility. Eventually, after multiple failed attempts, Nero had his mother killed. This act has been cited for centuries as proof of his monstrous nature, and it was monstrous. Matricide violated one of the most fundamental taboos of Roman society, but the sources also tell us that Nero was tormented by guilt afterwards. He reportedly suffered from nightmares, seeing his mother's ghost, hearing her voice. He consulted magicians, trying to summon her spirit so he could beg for forgiveness. This doesn't make the murder acceptable, but it does suggest that Nero was not a sociopath incapable of remorse. He was a deeply troubled young man who had committed an unforgivable act and could not escape its psychological consequences. As for his artistic ambitions, they were mocked by the senatorial class, but this mockery tells us more about Roman attitudes toward appropriate imperial behavior than about Nero's actual talent. In Roman culture, public performance was considered degrading, something done by slaves and freedmen, not by aristocrats and certainly not by emperors. When Nero insisted on performing publicly, singing and acting on stage, he was violating deeply held social norms. This made him vulnerable to mockery and contempt from the elite. But Nero seems to have genuinely loved the arts. He built theaters, patronized artists, composed music. He traveled to Greece, where he competed in artistic contests and was celebrated for his performances. The Greeks, who had different cultural values, appreciated his artistic sensibilities in a way the Roman aristocracy never did. To Nero, art may have been an escape from the brutal realities of imperial politics, a space where he could be himself rather than the role he was forced to play. The sources present his artistic interests as evidence of frivolity and neglect of duty, but perhaps they were evidence of a sensitive soul trying to find meaning in a life defined by violence and political necessity. Not all the emperors were portrayed as monsters. Some were presented sympathetically, usually because they aligned with the biographer's values or political perspectives. These sympathetic portrayals offer glimpses of the emotional weight of imperial power that are all the more moving for being rare. Consider Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 AD. Marcus is remembered as one of Rome's greatest emperors, a wise and humane leader who governed according to Stoic principles. His personal writings, the Meditations, reveal a man of profound introspection, constantly examining his own thoughts and motivations, striving to live virtuously in accordance with reason. But the Meditations also reveal the immense burden Marcus carried. He wrote these reflections while on military campaigns, dealing with invasions, plagues, and political crises. The text is shot through with weariness, with the struggle to maintain equanimity in the face of suffering. Marcus had to watch the Antonine Plague devastate the empire, killing millions of people. He had to lead armies against Germanic tribes and Parthian invaders. He had to manage a dysfunctional family, including a notoriously unfaithful wife and a son, Commodus, who showed little interest in philosophy or virtue. The ancient sources preserve moments of Marcus's grief. When Lucius Verus, his co-emperor and adoptive brother, died, Marcus wept openly. When the plague struck and cities were emptied of their populations, Marcus struggled to maintain his stoic composure. He wrote about the importance of accepting fate, of recognizing that suffering is part of the human condition, but the frequency with which he returns to these themes suggests that acceptance did not come easily. Marcus Aurelius was a man trying desperately to live up to his own philosophical ideals while bearing the weight of an empire in crisis. Or consider Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD. Claudius has a complicated reputation. Some sources portray him as surprisingly competent, an intelligent and learned man who governed effectively despite physical disabilities and a speech impediment that made him seem foolish. Other sources present him as weak, manipulated by freedmen and wives, a figure of mockery. But both traditions preserve something important about Claudius's emotional life, the experience of someone who spent most of his life being underestimated and humiliated. Claudius had a limp, possibly from cerebral palsy or polio. He stuttered, he drooled. In a society that prized physical perfection and military prowess, these disabilities made him an object of contempt. His own family was embarrassed by him. His grandmother refused to speak to him directly, sending messages through servants. His mother called him a monster, a man that nature had begun but not finished. Claudius retreated into scholarship. He wrote histories, including a massive work on the Etruscans and another on the Carthaginians. He studied language and proposed new letters to be added to the Latin alphabet. This intellectual life was probably his refuge, the one area where his disabilities didn't matter, where his mind could prove his worth. When he unexpectedly became emperor after Caligula's assassination, chosen because he was the only adult male of the imperial family available, Claudius finally had the opportunity to show what he could do. And he did surprisingly well. He expanded the empire, adding Britain as a province. He improved infrastructure, building aqueducts and harbors. He reformed the legal system, but he never escaped the mockery. Seneca, after Claudius's death, wrote the Apokolosyntosis, mocking the dead emperor's ascent to heaven, portraying him as an imbecile barely capable of speech. This cruelty, from one of Rome's great intellectuals, directed at a man who had struggled his entire life against contempt, is hard to read without feeling sympathy for Claudius. But sympathy was not always what the biographers were after. Sometimes they wanted monsters. They needed villains whose depravity could serve as moral lessons, whose stories could justify political changes, whose reputations could be sacrificed to larger narratives about the dangers of absolute power. And so they crafted portraits of emperors as irredeemably evil, as men who had descended into madness and depravity, as cautionary tales about what happens when one person holds too much power. These monstrous portraits became the most famous, the most enduring, the ones that shaped how subsequent generations understood tyranny. But how much of their evil was real, and how much was crafted by writers with agendas? To answer that, we need to examine the techniques of character assassination, the methods by which biographers transformed complicated human beings into two-dimensional villains. Some emperors became legends of depravity, their names synonymous with tyranny, cruelty, and madness. Caligula, Nero, Commodus, Domitian, Elagabalus. These names carry a weight of infamy that has persisted for 2,000 years. They are the standard examples used in political discourse when we want to warn about the dangers of absolute power. They appear in literature, film, and television as archetypal villains, embodiments of human evil. But who created these monsters? Not the emperors themselves, at least not entirely. The monsters were created by biographers who wrote decades or centuries after these rulers died, who had access to hostile sources, who were shaped by their own political biases, who needed these emperors to be villains for their narratives to work. The process of transforming a complicated historical figure into a monster involved specific techniques, rhetorical strategies that, once you recognize them, appear again and again in the ancient sources. The first and most powerful technique was sexual scandal. In Roman culture, sexual behavior was deeply connected to moral character and political fitness. A man who violated sexual norms, who was perceived as effeminate or excessively lustful, who transgressed boundaries of proper behavior, was considered morally corrupt and unfit to rule. The biographers understood this, and they used sexual rumors as a primary weapon to destroy imperial reputations. Suetonius, in particular, was obsessed with the sexual lives of emperors. His biographies are filled with explicit details about who slept with whom, what unusual practices they preferred, what violations they committed. Some of these accounts may be based on real gossip that circulated during the emperor's lifetimes. Others were probably invented or exaggerated. But the effect was the same, to paint these rulers as morally degenerate, controlled by base appetites rather than reason. Elagabalus, who reigned briefly in the early 3rd century, was described as wearing women's clothing, working as a prostitute in the imperial palace, marrying multiple men in mockery of Roman marriage customs. How many of these stories are true, we cannot know. Sexual rumors are notoriously unreliable, easy to invent, and impossible to disprove, especially when the subjects have been dead for centuries. What we can say is that these rumors served a purpose. They coded these emperors as morally unfit, as men who had violated the most fundamental norms of Roman society, as warnings about what happens when power is given to the wrong person. The second technique was to reframe political disagreements as insanity. If an emperor made decisions that the senatorial class disagreed with, if he challenged their privileges or threatened their power, he was portrayed as irrational, delusional, mad. This was particularly effective because it delegitimized the emperor's actions while absolving the writers of having to engage with the political substance of those actions. Caligula's supposed plan to make his horse Incitatus a consul is the perfect example. Suetonius presents this as evidence of Caligula's insanity, proof that he had lost touch with reality. But if we examine the context, a different interpretation emerges. Caligula had a contentious relationship with the Senate. He viewed many senators as corrupt and incompetent, more interested in their own power and wealth than in governing effectively. The story about the horse may have been a piece of political theater, a deliberate insult designed to communicate that Caligula viewed the consulship as so meaningless that even a horse could do the job. It was not evidence of insanity, but of contempt, a pointed critique of senatorial pretensions. Similarly, when emperors claimed divine honors or insisted on being worshipped as gods, this was presented as evidence of megalomania. But emperor worship was a complex phenomenon in the Roman world. In the eastern provinces, where Greek and Egyptian traditions of divine kingship were common, treating the emperor as a god was normal. In Rome itself, the practice was more controversial, but even there, deceased emperors were often deified. When living emperors claimed divine status, they were often making political and religious statements, asserting their authority, positioning themselves within traditional power structures. The biographers stripped away this context and presented it as simple madness. The third technique was the invention and embellishment of anecdotes. Ancient biography was not constrained by modern standards of evidence. Biographers felt free to include stories based on rumor, hearsay, or even their own imagination if those stories fit the moral portrait they were trying to create. Once an anecdote entered the biographical tradition, it took on a life of its own, repeated by subsequent writers, elaborated upon, treated as historical fact. Consider the story of Nero fiddling while Rome burned. This image has become iconic, the ultimate symbol of callous indifference to suffering, but the story is almost certainly false. For one thing, the fiddle had not been invented yet. Suetonius and Tacitus claim that Nero sang about the fall of Troy while watching Rome burn from a tower, but even this version is contradicted by other evidence. Tacitus himself, in the same work, mentions that Nero was not in Rome when the fire started, but rushed back to help coordinate relief efforts. He opened his gardens to refugees, brought in food supplies, and organized reconstruction efforts. The fire was devastating, destroying much of the city, and Nero did use the cleared land to build his enormous golden house, which made him unpopular. But the image of him performing while the city burned seems to be a later invention, a way of symbolizing his perceived vanity and lack of concern for his people. The story was too good not to be true, too perfect an encapsulation of tyrannical indifference, and so it persisted, repeated by every subsequent generation until it became an established fact. The fourth technique was guilt by association and the imputation of hidden motives. When emperors took actions that could be interpreted neutrally or positively, biographers framed those actions in the worst possible light, suggesting sinister motivations even when there was no evidence for them. If an emperor executed someone, it was because he was cruel and paranoid, not because the person had actually conspired against him. If he showed mercy, it was weakness or manipulation, not genuine compassion. Every action was filtered through a lens of suspicion that made virtue impossible. Let us look more carefully at specific cases, examining how the biographical tradition created monsters out of men. Caligula remains the most extreme example. The stories about him are genuinely shocking, almost beyond belief. He supposedly declared himself a god and had conversations with statues of Jupiter. He built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples just so he could ride across it in triumph, wasting enormous resources on a display of vanity. He tortured and killed people randomly for entertainment. He committed incest with his sisters and then had them executed. He planned military campaigns that made no strategic sense and then abandoned them on whim. But here is what we need to consider. Almost all of these stories come from Suetonius, writing 80 years after Caligula's death. Suetonius had access to sources, including some that were contemporary with Caligula, but he also had an agenda. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, to which Caligula belonged, had ended badly with Nero's suicide. By the time Suetonius was writing, that dynasty had been superseded by others, and there was no political cost to portraying its emperors in the worst possible light. In fact, there were benefits. Making the Julio-Claudians look bad made subsequent dynasties look better by comparison. Moreover, Suetonius's biography of Caligula contains numerous inconsistencies and implausibilities. Some of the stories contradict each other. Some seem designed more for entertainment value than for historical accuracy. The portrait that emerges is almost cartoonishly evil, lacking the psychological complexity we find in Suetonius's accounts of other emperors. This raises the possibility that the Caligula we know is partly a literary creation, a composite of rumors, propaganda, and invention designed to create the archetypal mad tyrant. This does not mean Caligula was a good emperor or even a decent person. He reigned for less than 4 years and was assassinated by his own guards, which suggests serious problems with his rule. But the specific stories that have defined his reputation may be less reliable than we assume. The incest allegations, for instance, follow a pattern common in Roman political discourse, where accusing someone of incest was a standard way to attack their moral character. The stories about his divine pretensions may reflect real religious innovations that seemed less strange in the context of Roman emperor worship than they appear in isolation. The tales of random cruelty may be exaggerations of real acts of political violence. What we are left with is uncertainty. We cannot know the real Caligula. The sources are too hostile, too distant in time, too shaped by political agendas. But we can recognize that the monster we have inherited is at least partly a construction, a creation of biographers who needed him to be a villain. The case of Commodus is equally instructive. Commodus ruled from 180 to 192 AD, succeeding his father Marcus Aurelius. The contrast between the philosopher-emperor and his son became a central theme in how Commodus was remembered. How could the wise and virtuous Marcus have produced such a terrible heir? The ancient sources, particularly Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, portray Commodus as everything his father was not. Where Marcus was disciplined and dutiful, Commodus was lazy and pleasure-seeking. Where Marcus was a stoic philosopher, Commodus was an ignorant brute. Where Marcus led armies, Commodus played at being a gladiator. The gladiator story is the defining image of Commodus. He supposedly descended into the arena to fight as a gladiator, a shocking violation of imperial dignity. He renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana. He styled himself as Hercules, appearing in public wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club. He killed senators who opposed him and surrounded himself with sycophants. Eventually, he was assassinated in a palace conspiracy. This portrait has shaped every subsequent depiction of Commodus, from Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire to the film Gladiator. But recent scholarship has revealed a more complicated picture. Administrative documents from Commodus's reign show an empire that continued to function effectively. The bureaucracy operated, taxes were collected, the borders were defended. Commodus may have delegated much of the actual governing to capable administrators, but this does not necessarily indicate incompetence. It may simply reflect a different leadership style. As for the gladiatorial performances, these were indeed shocking to the senatorial class, but they may have been politically calculated. Gladiators were immensely popular with the common people of Rome. By appearing in the arena, Commodus was positioning himself as a populist emperor, someone who shared the pleasures of ordinary Romans rather than maintaining aristocratic distance. The senators were horrified, but the plebeians may have loved it. Commodus was challenging the social norms that gave the senatorial class its prestige, and they responded by destroying his reputation in the histories they wrote. The renaming of Rome and the Hercules identification were unusual but not unprecedented. Other emperors had engaged in similar acts of self-aggrandizement. The difference is that Commodus had alienated the senatorial historians who would write about him. His reign ended with his assassination, and once he was dead, there was no one to defend his memory. The sources we have come from his enemies, from senators who despised him, and they shaped the historical record accordingly. Then there is Elagabalus, one of the most maligned emperors in Roman history. He ruled for only 4 years, from 218 to 222 AD, ascending to the throne at age 14 and being assassinated at 18. The sources describe him as utterly depraved, obsessed with exotic Eastern religions, wearing women's clothing, marrying multiple times including marriages to men, prostituting himself in the imperial palace, committing acts of sexual excess that shocked even jaded Romans. But Elagabalus's real crime may have been religious innovation. He was a priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal before becoming emperor, and he attempted to install this god as the supreme deity of the Roman pantheon, building a massive temple in Rome and performing elaborate rituals. This was deeply offensive to traditional Romans, who viewed their gods and religious practices as essential to Roman identity. By elevating a foreign deity and practicing foreign rituals, Elagabalus was threatening the very foundation of what it meant to be Roman. The sexual allegations against Elagabalus follow familiar patterns. Accusations of wearing women's clothing and acting as a passive partner in sexual relationships were standard ways to feminize and delegitimize male political figures in Roman discourse. Whether these accusations reflected real aspects of Elagabalus's behavior or identity, or were simply political attacks using the rhetoric of gender transgression, is impossible to determine. What is clear is that Elagabalus violated deeply held Roman norms about religion, gender, and appropriate imperial behavior, and the sources punished him for it by constructing him as a monster of depravity. The Historia Augusta, our main source for Elagabalus, is particularly unreliable. As mentioned earlier, this text is probably a later forgery, and many of its most scandalous stories about various emperors appear nowhere else. The account of Elagabalus is so extreme, so filled with unverifiable and implausible details, that modern historians treat it with profound skepticism. But for centuries, it was accepted as historical fact, and Elagabalus became the ultimate example of an emperor whose foreign origins and alien customs corrupted Rome. What all these cases reveal is a consistent pattern. Emperors who challenged senatorial power, who violated Roman social and religious norms, who were killed and had no successors to defend their memory, these emperors became monsters in the biographical tradition. Their stories were exaggerated, embellished, and sometimes invented to serve the political and moral purposes of the writers. The techniques of character assassination, sexual scandal, imputation of insanity, invented anecdotes, and hostile framing transformed complex historical figures into archetypal villains. The real tragedy is not just that these emperors may have been misrepresented, it is that their humanity was stripped away. They became symbols, cautionary tales, examples to be cited in moral and political arguments. But symbols are not people. They do not bleed, do not fear, do not grieve. The emperors who were turned into monsters had real lives, real emotions, real struggles. They made choices in contexts we can barely understand, under pressures we can hardly imagine. Caligula, the traumatized young man who watched his family destroyed. Nero, the insecure artist trapped in a role he never wanted. Commodus, trying to forge a different kind of imperial identity and being destroyed for it. Elagabalus, a teenage boy attempting to reconcile his religious devotion with the expectations of Roman power. These were human beings, not cartoons of evil. They made terrible choices, committed real atrocities, caused genuine suffering. But they were also shaped by circumstances largely beyond their control, by the impossible position of being a Roman emperor, by the paranoia and violence that was endemic to imperial politics. The biographers, in their zeal to create moral lessons, to serve political agendas, to entertain their readers with scandalous stories, robbed these figures of their complexity. They created simplified narratives where good emperors were uniformly virtuous and bad emperors were uniformly depraved. But human beings do not work that way. We are all mixtures of virtue and vice, wisdom and folly, strength and weakness. The emperors were no different, except that their flaws and virtues played out on a world historical stage, with consequences that affected millions of lives. And once the biographical tradition established these reputations, they became almost impossible to challenge. Each subsequent writer drew on earlier sources, repeating and embellishing the stories. The distance from the actual events grew larger, but the certainty of the accounts remained high. By the time we reached the medieval and early modern periods, the reputations of Rome's emperors were set in stone. Caligula was mad, Nero was a tyrant, Commodus was a fool. These became historical facts, taught to every schoolchild, referenced in every political debate about power and its abuses. But they were not facts, they were stories, stories created by men with agendas, shaped by political contexts, filtered through cultural biases. Stories that served purposes in their own time, but that we have inherited as objective history. And because we have inherited them, they continue to shape how we think about power, how we judge leaders, how we understand the relationship between authority and morality. So we return to where we began, standing in the ruins of Rome, surrounded by the echoes of emperors whose shadows still dominate the world. But now we understand something crucial. Those shadows are not cast by the emperors themselves. They are cast by the writers who came after, by the biographers who held pens instead of swords, by the obscure men who shaped the reputations of rulers long after they had turned to dust. History is not what happened. History is what someone chose to write. And in ancient Rome, what was chosen to be written was shaped by political agendas, personal grudges, moral philosophies, and the entertainment value of scandalous stories. The biographers were not neutral observers. They were participants in political struggles, moralists with lessons to teach, entertainers with audiences to please. They had every reason to distort, to exaggerate, to invent when necessary. This does not mean we should dismiss everything in the ancient sources. Archaeological evidence, contemporary inscriptions, administrative documents, these provide some check on the literary tradition. Many of the events described by the biographers certainly happened. Emperors did commit acts of violence, did make poor decisions, did abuse their power. The sources are not entirely fiction. But the interpretations, the motivations attributed to emperors, the psychological portraits, the scandalous anecdotes that have defined their reputations, these are far less reliable. They tell us as much about the biographers and their times as they do about the emperors themselves. When we read Suetonius's gossipy scandals, we are learning about what Romans found entertaining and morally significant. When we read Tacitus's dark cynicism, we are encountering senatorial resentment of imperial power. When we read the Historia Augusta's wild fabrications, we are seeing how later generations imagined the past. Implications extend far beyond ancient Rome. If the emperors we thought we knew are really characters created by hostile biographers, then what does this mean for how we understand leadership, power, and historical reputation more broadly? Every leader who has ever lived has been subject to the same forces that shaped the reputations of Rome's emperors. Political opponents with agendas, biographers with moral lessons to teach, later generations projecting their own concerns onto the past. Consider how quickly reputations can be made and destroyed in our own time. A single scandal, real or manufactured, can define a public figure forever. A hostile biography can reshape how someone is remembered. The winners of political struggles write the histories, and the losers become villains. The same dynamics that operated in ancient Rome operate today, though perhaps with different media and different techniques. This should make us more skeptical, more careful about accepting historical narratives at face value. It should make us ask questions about who is telling the story, what their agenda might be, what evidence they are using, and what they might be leaving out. It should make us more empathetic, more willing to see the humanity even in figures who have been condemned by history. Because behind every reputation is a human being, complex and flawed, shaped by circumstances we can never fully understand. The emperors of Rome were not the simple figures we have inherited. They were not uniformly good or uniformly evil. They were people trying to navigate impossible situations, making choices with incomplete information, living under pressures that would break most of us. Some of them made terrible choices. Some of them caused immense suffering, but they were all human. And the biographers who wrote about them, in stripping away that humanity to create morality tales and political propaganda, did a disservice not just to the emperors, but to history itself. We cannot recover the true emperors now. Too much time has passed, too many sources have been lost, too many layers of interpretation have accumulated, but we can recognize the fragility of what we think we know. We can acknowledge that the stories we have inherited are constructions shaped by the needs and biases of those who wrote them. We can approach history with humility, recognizing the limits of our knowledge. And perhaps most importantly, we can extend this understanding to our own time. When we judge contemporary leaders, when we consume biographical accounts, when we participate in the construction of historical reputations, we should remember the obscure Roman biographers who defined emperors. We should remember that history is not what happened, but what someone chose to write. We should remember that the pen outlives the sword, and that the stories we tell today will shape how future generations understand our time. The emperors may have ruled Rome, but their biographers ruled time, and their words still whisper through history, reminding us that truth is fragile, reputations are malleable, and the boundary between fact and myth is thinner than we imagine. In the ruins of Rome, the stones remain silent, but the voices of the biographers echo on, shaping our world in ways we are only beginning to understand. The question we must ask ourselves is this: if the most powerful men in history could be rewritten by obscure writers with agendas, what does that mean for the stories we believe about anyone? What does it mean for the narratives we construct about ourselves, about our leaders, about our own time? The answer is uncomfortable, but necessary. It means that we must always question, always doubt, always look beneath the surface of the stories we are told. Because history is not a record of what happened. It is a story about what happened, told by someone with a reason to tell it that way. And in that realization lies both a warning and an opportunity. The warning is that we should never fully trust any single narrative, any single version of events, any single interpretation of a life. The opportunity is that we can choose to tell better stories, more honest stories, more humane stories. We can recognize the complexity of human beings, resist the temptation to reduce people to simple categories of good and evil, and acknowledge that every life, every choice, every moment of history exists in a context that we can never fully reconstruct. The obscure Roman biographers shaped the reputations of emperors for 2,000 years. Their words became the foundation of how we understand power, tyranny, and human nature. But now, understanding how they did it, understanding the techniques they used, and the agendas they served, we can begin to read history differently. Not as a simple record of heroes and villains, but as a complex tapestry woven by human hands, full of gaps and distortions, requiring constant interpretation and reinterpretation. The emperors are long dead, the biographers are long dead, but the stories remain, living things that continue to evolve with each generation that reads them. And in recognizing that these are stories, not truths, we take the first step toward a more honest relationship with history. We acknowledge that the past is not fixed, but is constantly being remade in the present. We accept the responsibility that comes with that understanding, the responsibility to tell stories that honor complexity rather than simplify it, that preserve humanity rather than destroy it. In the end, the greatest lesson of the obscure Roman biographers is not about ancient history. It is about us, about how we remember, how we judge, how we tell stories about the people who shape our world. The biographers showed us that reputation is a weapon, that narrative is power, that the stories we tell about others reveal more about ourselves than about them. And they showed us that these stories, once told, take on lives of their own, shaping reality long after the events they describe have faded into dust. So when you hear the name Caligula, think not just of the monster, but of the traumatized young man. When you hear Nero, think not just of the tyrant, but of the insecure artist. When you hear Commodus, think not just of the fool, but of someone trying to forge a different path. And remember always that between the person and the reputation stands a biographer, a writer with a pen and an agenda, someone who chose what to preserve and what to destroy, what to exaggerate and what to omit. History is written by the victors, yes, but more than that, history is written by the writers, and the power they wield is greater than any emperor's because it extends across time, shaping not just their own generation, but all the generations that follow. The obscure Roman biographers understood this power and used it to define emperors for eternity. Understanding how they did it is the first step toward freeing ourselves from the myths they created and learning to see the past and the present with clearer eyes. The ruins of Rome stand silent, but the whispers of the biographers echo through the centuries. And in those whispers, if we listen carefully, we can hear not just the voices of ancient writers, but the voice of history itself, telling us that truth is fragile, reputations are constructed, and the stories we believe shape the world we live in. The emperors ruled Rome for a few years or decades. The biographers ruled forever. And their lesson, uncomfortable but essential, is that the pen will always outlive the sword, and the storyteller will always outlast the king.